Well, just moments ago, the Council unanimously approved the Budget and Finance Committee's recommendations for revisions to the Mayor's budget. Shortly, we'll be voting on a budget resolution that it encapsulates all those changes. This is an extraordinary budget in extraordinary times. This is a budget that managed to not only ensure the largest reserve that the city has ever had in its entire history, demonstrating the fiscal responsibility of this budget, but it also made substantial new investments in services that the constituents of this city have demanded and deserved for years. I joined the council during the Great Recession and became budget chair a couple of years after that. And this city still has not recovered from the reductions that we suffered during the Great Recession. But this budget moves us substantially forward in restoring those critical services, including services in and improvements at our parks throughout the city. Almost $1 billion on services relating to homelessness. A substantial investment in environmental protection, including protecting and expanding the tree canopy and ensuring a smooth transition away from oil and gas production in the city of Los Angeles. This budget invests tremendous resources in boosting the economic recovery of Los Angeles as we emerge from the pandemic in a way that will create jobs throughout the city and especially in our disadvantaged communities. We're investing in streets, street improvements, street sweeping, making our neighborhoods cleaner, all while maintaining a reserve that ensures that this will be a budget that will help us to survive through future times in the event that the economy does not remain as strong as it appears that it is now. So I'm very, very proud of the work that we did in the committee. I'm proud of my colleagues in the Council for once again unanimously approving the work of the Budget and Finance Committee. And I'm especially pleased and honored to have had the support of our Council President throughout this process. This has been a close partnership and collaboration between the Council President and my committee, and I want to thank her and recognize Council President Nury Martinez.
Thank you, Mr. Krekorian. Let me begin by recognizing you and your extraordinary efforts as chair of the Budget Committee and managing a budget proposal that accomplishes so much while ensuring that our reserves are at the highest level we've ever seen. The action by this council recognizes this moment in history. A city of 4 million people, too many Angelenos still need our help and still need our assistance, and this budget reflects that. Mr. Krekorian and I have ensured that we continue to work with the mayor and recognized early on that we needed to especially also recognize the fact that we needed to, with the help of the Biden administration and federal monies, keep to our priorities and our principles, which is to pay everything we borrowed during the pandemic, restore our reserves, including our budget stabilization fund, restore city services, which are at the core of the priority of this council, and we continue to meet the needs of the community as we move forward and try to recover from COVID. So these are the priorities of the city council. I was glad to see that so many of us came together and recognized the needs of folks who came to listen during our listening sessions. I gave input throughout the city. We had 4 listening sessions throughout the city of Los Angeles, and we heard people's voices. We ensured that this budget was a reflection of what they were asking for as much as we could. And we know that moving forward, there's moving pieces to this budget that we're going to have to recognize, that are going to have to, at some point, make appropriate adjustments if we have to. But nevertheless, I'm very proud of this budget. I'm very proud of the work that Mr. Krekorian has done. And with that, we'll take any questions.
Mr. Krekorian, if you would, there's a matter of budget increase for the LAPD. Has that held to that 3% the mayor wanted, or is there still some adjustments that need to be made to that?
So There was minor adjustment in the total amount of the police budget in the Budget and Finance Committee's recommendations, which were really the result of budgetary analysis. There was no reduction in the hiring plan that the mayor proposed. So the existing hiring plan to achieve the personnel levels that the mayor proposed in his budget held throughout the budget process and throughout the committee's work today.
Is that literally hiring to the point of attrition within the department, but not really going too much above that?
If I'm not mistaken, I think we're scheduled to. It depends on what the attrition turns out to be, obviously, and that's the challenge, and it's going to change throughout the year because there has been there's been a cessation of filling the new classes, so there is going to be a drop before it starts to come back up throughout the course of the budget year. I think that the targeted number, if I'm not mistaken, was 9,700 or 9,750. I don't know, 9,750.
On the idea of homelessness, Madam President, I think you might want to comment on this one. There's a dramatic increase in funding for what they call the CARE and CARE Plus teams. How critical are those really going to be toward actually getting people off the streets into supportive housing, into care beyond what they could get on the street or at the missions?
Well, our priority has been housing our unsheltered, neighbors, and so there is a significant effort and a significant amount of money in this budget for Project Roomkey. There's help from the federal government, the state as well. So we need to ensure that our priority is to house individuals, and we also have to recognize the state of our city. This is completely unacceptable, and we need to regain the public's trust. Our taxpayers have taxed themselves, hoping that we'll build the housing necessary to house folks as soon as possible, but also recognizing that we have an obligation to ensure that we restore cleanliness to our neighborhoods. All you need to do is walk into any community, drive around throughout the city, and you will see the number of encampments, the trash, the bulky items. This all needs to be addressed. So I will 100% agree that we need to restore CARE Plus and CARE Plus One to what we had before the pandemic, and we need to ensure that people recognize that we're serious about cleaning up the city.
Councilmember, Mayor Garcetti proposed this budget, calling it the justice budget and the most progressive spending budget in LA history. Would you say this final budget addresses that?
I believe that the budget, at its core, is a accountability budget. That's what I refer to it. It's accountable to city services, accountable to our fiscal responsibilities, and it's also accountable to the systemic inequities that exist throughout our city. So that is what I would call it. And so we've met all those three buckets, and we're trying to ensure that people recognize that. So.
The city of Los Angeles also received money from the Federal's CARE Act. You got 188 pages of guidance on how to spend that money. How did that affect this budget?
Well, those guidelines are changing, Mr. Krekorian. I think you spoke to that at the beginning of our budget hearing this morning. Did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, thank you. So in addition to the CARES Act money, of course, more recently, there is, since the Biden administration has been elected, there's the American Recovery Plan money, which amounts to about $1.3 billion paid in two tranches, one in the current fiscal year and half of it in the fiscal year that we're talking about for this budget. So virtually the entirety of the $650 million that we just received this week is being used for the purposes that the council president mentioned: repaying debt, ensuring that we finish the year with a balanced budget, deficit elimination for this fiscal year. But the second tranche of money has allowed a great deal of investment in important services that I talked about in the coming fiscal year. It's important for everybody to remember this is one-time money. So this budget has tried to focus on one-time expenditures that will pay dividends for many years, like $100 million to our parks that will help increase the number of daycare centers that we have in our parks, and build new playgrounds and ball fields and lighting and security and HVAC in parks throughout our city. That's one-time investment that will pay dividends for generations. Those are the sorts of things that we tried to focus on. But to your point about the regulations, we received the draft regulations after the committee had actually acted on its recommendations. And so we're trying to, or we're in the midst of it, so we're trying to adjust on the fly to what we think we're hearing from the federal government. But those regulations are not even finalized yet. They're in their comment period. So cities throughout America are going to be providing comment about the proposed guidelines. And to the council president's point, this process that we started today with the approval of these recommendations will continue throughout the fiscal year as the Budget and Finance Committee continues to analyze that, consider changes in the budget throughout our financial status reports and otherwise. We'll be making revisions as we go throughout the year.
Councilman, something that everybody can deal with is the idea or acknowledge is the problem of streets. You drive on them, you're battering your cars, everything else like that. How much money do we actually have, and how many miles of street repaving and street rehabilitation does this budget really allot for?
So there's $182 million in funding dedicated to improving the condition and purpose of our streets. That breaks down to $142 million for pavement preservation, $26 million to recover failed streets. And very often, once a street gets to a state where it's considered a failed street, it becomes almost too expensive to repair, and so we tend not to budget for it. Well, this has $26 million to help to recover those streets. And then there's almost $10 million that will go to continue our investments in complete streets projects, and about $4 million to repair and maintain bike lanes, which is critically important to the taxpayers of this city, not just bicyclists, but also to ensure that we don't have the liability that comes from accidents that happen when those streets are not in a state of good repair.
How many miles of street are we talking about resurfacing, repaving, or bringing back up? Is it 1,000 more? What?
That funding that I just described pays for 1,700 lane miles of improved streets in this next year. We'll be repaving or resurfacing almost 5 lane miles every single day.
I wanted to go back to the LAPD budget question for a minute. So my understanding is when you guys cut the $150 million last year, you took staffing down to about 9,750, and that since then it's fallen to about 9,450. And so what I think I heard you say is that you're bringing it back up to about 9,700, and I heard that you guys wanted to do this, but what is the policy rationale? What is the reason you feel like you need to rebuild the number of officers? That didn't come up a ton today, and because it does represent an increase ultimately to the budget, and there were a lot of people asking for a reduction, what's the reason the city needs to do this?
You know, we had a number of listening sessions, and I think, Paul, you were part of some of the earlier conversations even before we started to debate the budget. And so I think that policing looks very different in different neighborhoods and different communities. And for us, the $150 million was to reinvest it in communities that not necessarily are asking for additional police officers, but are actually asking for additional resources. And so there are communities who do desire more policing. And so when we heard community in these listening sessions, we heard a variety of input. And so I think in trying to come up with that magic number of how many police officers we should hire, we have to recognize that not everyone in our city or throughout our communities, I think, for example, our districts might be very similar in a sense that our communities do want additional police officers. They feel safer that way. Some other communities don't. And so I think in working with the mayor, trying to come up with that magic number, and that number might actually not be 9,700. I don't know exactly what the number is going to end up being, but we came to the agreement that would be a number that would be suitable not only for us, but for the police department, especially when it comes to attrition. Is there anything else you want to add?
I guess what I would just add to that is, needless to say, that the issue of how large the police department should be is a divisive and controversial issue for the very reasons that the council president mentioned, because it depends on the perspective of the individual and the community that you're asking. That being said, I think most people in the city readily see that we need to have a police department in the city of Los Angeles, and that it needs to be of a large enough size to be able to provide policing services throughout the city. Whether those services can be provided in a more efficient way by civilianizing some of the work is a legitimate question, and this budget includes hiring of more civilian employees that were cut during the last, during this last year. So bringing back some of those civilian employees is an important way to bring more efficiency and more effectiveness to the police department. Whether we can successfully explore alternatives to policing in particular circumstances is an important discussion that the city needs to continue to have. But that doesn't come without expense. And in some respects, our community safety partnerships and some of the other things that have been tremendously successful in changing the nature of policing in Los Angeles are expensive programs. So, I don't... This is not a discussion that's as simple as saying just cut the police department's budget. Even transforming the police department requires expenditures, which I think this budget has responsibly made.
The other thing that's happened during the COVID pandemic is I think the city's kind of gone into new areas that it really didn't have much responsibility or involvement in before. And one of the things I'm wondering is, in this budget, there was a big move by, I think, the budget committee to add funding for childcare. And one of the things I'm wondering is, what's the policy argument for doing that? And do you view that as an expansion of something you're already doing, or is that really moving into kind of a new line of business?
Wow, if you see the numbers, and in fact, you often hear me talk about almost 5 million jobs that were lost during the pandemic. Predominantly all those jobs were lost, were job losses that women took. And so a lot of what we continue to hear, whether it be community or people that we work with or people that we are neighbors with, is that without childcare, people cannot go back to work. And as long as schools are not fully reopened with in-person learning, it is going to be very difficult for a parent or a single mom to be able to take care of her child and return back to work. So this is something that I've been very focused on, incredibly passionate about. If you talk to 1 out of 4 women, the reason they've not gone back to work or they've had to basically walk away from their careers is because of the lack of childcare. And I think this is something that this country has failed in providing adequate and affordable childcare for families in this country. And if we're given an opportunity and use this money in a way where we can bring people back to work, that's what I think is a good use of our money. We saw that with our alternative learning sites, how successful they were. The thank yous, the people that we would interact with at the parks, just saying thank you for having this option for me in my neighborhood, so that if you were lucky enough to go back to work and still have a job, you were able to have your child be at a safe place so that parent can go back to work. I think it's a fundamental right to be able to provide adequate childcare for someone's child. Until schools are reopened, I think our city needs to continue to step up for working families and for moms to be able to go back to work. It's that simple.
This budget
So let me, if I just add to Dave's question, you're certainly right that there's a lot in this budget that may not typically be seen as being core city services. And I think that's a response to the moment. We have an infusion of one-time money. We have significant one-time social and economic needs right now as well. That by investing in helping to address some of those needs, this will help the city move forward out of the pandemic and the economic consequences of that. So I think while it's certainly preferable that other levels of government step up and provide some of the relief that we're attempting to provide, rather than having that fall on the shoulders of municipal government, this budget at least gets us through this difficult time. On child care specifically, I want to say this. I don't consider the child care investment of that kind of category. And here's why. 10 years ago, I had to vote to cut child care in this city. And it remains maybe the most difficult vote I've taken in my time on the council, because before the Great Recession, we had over 20 child care centers in recreation and in parks throughout the city. Over 20. Today we have 2 because of the cuts that we had to make during the Great Recession. And that is an outrageous impact on working families throughout Los Angeles who had come to rely on that child care service that we provided in parks. So it was very important to me, and I know this is very close to the heart of the council president and others of our colleagues, to begin to restore those pre-existing child care services that existed before the recession to help uplift working families and get them the security that they need to know that they can go back to work and their children will be safely taken care of.
This budget supports a new youth development department. What else is new or stands out to you this year?
It's a long list. There are 2 new departments. One is the Youth Development Department, and the other is the Children and
Family.
Sorry, it's new. I don't remember the name. Community Investments for Families. Thank you. Now, youth development is entirely new, but it embraces, the idea is, and much of this policy development is still unfinished. So we've done the budget part of it, but the policy development will happen in the council over the coming year. But the idea of the Youth Development Department is to embrace many of the youth programs that exist in the city and in other city departments, bring them under one umbrella where there's universal oversight, consistency in the way they're managed, and so on. Our previous Department of Housing and Community Investment is being split in this budget. So one department will focus on housing, the other will focus on families and community investment. It's how it used to be 12, 15 years ago, something like that, before these departments were merged. But much of what the departments are going to do is still going to be subject to policy development in the council.
Can you do a brief summary in Spanish, please?
Okay. Quisiera reconocer al concejal Paul Krekorian, que es también la persona que está encargada del comité de presupuesto aquí en la ciudad de Los Ángeles, por reconocer las necesidades de las familias trabajadoras en esta ciudad. Este presupuesto no nomás asegura de que tengamos cuidado infantil para nuestros hijos, pero que también haya servicios para nuestros parques, y también asegurándonos de que tenemos una reserva para en caso de emergencia. So, este presupuesto no nomás balancea nuestro presupuesto, tiene dinero en la reserva de emergencia, pero también está restaurando los servicios que tanta gente en la comunidad ha pedido a través de los parques, cuidado infantil, también reparando nuestras calles y tratando de solucionar los servicios que esta ciudad por mucho tiempo no ha podido haber tenido el dinero y los fondos para poder reparar. Esos son los servicios que la comunidad ha pedido a través de nuestras juntas comunitarias, y es lo que les estamos otorgando a la comunidad hoy. All right. Thank you.
Anything else? Thank you all very much.